Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we once again have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. Dr. Kripal holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. He is also the author of many fine books on the topics of religion, the paranormal, Gnosticism, spirituality, and culture. Dr. Jeff, welcome back.
Thanks. Happy to be here, Gordon.
Oh, very, very happy to have you back. It's sort of strange days at the moment, though, I think.
Yeah, these are very strange days. I think all of us have been struggling one way or another with them, for sure.
Yeah, well, it kind of got me thinking. It got me thinking about worldviews because, as I sort of mentioned before we hit the record button, that Dilbert comic guy who became prominent during the election mentioned something the other day which I thought was quite interesting, which is that there's now sort of two completely separate movies going on in America. So the data points out there are interpreted as completely separate depending on which movie you happen to be watching. And that got me thinking, well, we're talking about worldviews and who is the biggest worldview nerd I know, and that was you.
Okay. Again, happy to play that role. So we'll see if I can pull it off.
Nice one. Well, I mean, you are a comparativist or a religious scholar specializing in comparison. So I guess question one would be, how would you tell us what the comparison of religions is about and what it was about, because it's kind of gone on a politically fraught journey of its own.
Yeah, so it's actually a long story, and I'll try to keep it fairly brief. The academic study of religion really is about 200 years old now, and it really births in the early 19th century with early biblical criticism and the comparison of the different gospels and the different texts of the Hebrew Bible, and the realization that they are not what we thought they were. They're not authored by single people. They don't have clear genealogies. They're multiple, and they represent essentially cultural wars or cultural debates of their own time. And then that flowed into 19th century with at that point late European colonialism and the birth of disciplines like anthropology and the study of languages and then the study of religions. So it has its own difficult history that is wrapped up in European colonialism and notions of cultural superiority. But over the last, I don't know, four or five decades, it's really kind of struggled with and I hope through a lot of that. And I think one of the main more recent inspirations for the comparative study of religion was actually the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, in which young people in these Western cultures embraced essentially non-Western religions in great numbers and with great enthusiasm and perhaps with great naivete as well at times. But there was a real influx of new religious worldviews into Western culture during that time. And so today, a lot of the most senior people who study religion actually came to that vocation in the counterculture, either a trip to India or Japan or a particular psychedelic trip or what have you. It often originated for these individuals in some kind of altered state. And so I think today the field is sort of split on whether its true origins are colonial or countercultural, and how to sort of balance those two narratives. I'm clearly of the second camp. I think the countercultural origins are more recent and more profound and frankly far more positive, and that we have to compare religions. I mean, there are a lot of folks in the academy who would argue we shouldn't be doing comparison at all because it always privileges the worldview of the person or community doing the comparison. My view is the opposite, that human beings have to compare and they will always compare. And if professionals just stop comparing religions for whatever reasonable notions, the world will just go on comparing religions very badly now without any guidance or any instruction from people who think about these things for their whole lives. So I'm a big advocate of comparison, and I think much that is wrong about our present worldview and the kind of isolationism and religious nationalisms that have taken over are essentially crises in comparison. They're failures to compare human beings in a sufficiently generous and imaginative way.
Pete Carroll, who founded Chaos Magic, said, "A god ignored is a demon born," and I think that's what you're talking about, because it's a cognitive impossibility to not compare, and it's kind of weak to sort of step back and go, "Oh, you can't compare because it privileges." No, you have to, and you have to keep that intention.
That's right, and I'm truly humbled that my 5-minute rant you reduced to 10 words.
Oh well, they weren't mine either, so we can thank Mr. Carroll for that. I mean, so if you think it started I see what you mean about with some degree of naivete in the '60s, because it's almost a different kind of Orientalism than the imperial one, which sort of considered, with some dissent from this, but considered European cultures to be superior to Asian and South Asian cultures. But in the '60s, to sort of uniformly consider them Asian cultures superior to European-derived ones is another form of Orientalism, isn't it?
Well, yes, yes, it is. I mean, when I referred to the naivete, the forms of, say, Hinduism or Buddhism or certainly Taoism that were embraced in the 60s and 70s were often brought to the West by traveling teachers, gurus, lamas, roshis. And what a lot of the young people didn't realize is that they were essentially receiving the more countercultural or even tantric forms of these religions, and that the religions themselves on the ground were far more conservative than they realized. And this is actually a big part of my early work on the American reception of Asian religions. That what essentially comes to America in the 60s and 70s are the tantric forms of Hinduism and Buddhism, and those work so well because the tantric forms are essentially the countercultures of Asia. And so the countercultures of Asia were coming to the counterculture of the West, and there was this kind of deep resonance that happened. But all of that overlooks the fundamentally conservative nature of most Asian cultures.
Gotcha. So, I mean, you've written a whole book about this, but if you do the comparison of religion right, do you always end up a Gnostic?
I don't think so. I mean, I do personally. I seem to be neurologically wired for Gnosticism, but no, not everybody arrives at a Gnostic position. I do think, though, that if you do comparison deeply enough and well enough, and we can talk about what that means, I do think your worldview loosens up considerably, and you let a lot more of the world, and so a lot more different kinds of human beings into your worldview. I think it does have not an inevitable, but an overwhelming liberal or inclusive spirit to it.
So, what does that look like then? So, what's best practice, would you say, in that form of comparison that has a Gnostifying, liberalizing effect?
Well, so again, I wrote this whole book called Comparing Religions about this. There's a lot of uh, principles here, but the fundamental one is you when you're comparing 2 or 3 religious systems, you compare phenomena within those systems at relatively similar level. In other words, you don't compare the best of your religion to the worst of someone else's. That's just fundamentally wrong. And you also try to compare. When you're comparing, you're always balancing sameness and difference. You're never reducing it all to the same thing, and yet you're never also arguing that everyone's so entirely different that there's nothing to compare. A good comparison always has some kind of tensive balance between similarity and difference. And then finally, the other really big one is what we call reflexivity. A good comparison knows that it's comparing. It also knows what its own assumptions are, and it's very transparent and open about those assumptions. It's inherently reflexive. It doesn't project onto the other one's own biases or assumptions. It owns those assumptions and biases, and may in fact think through them, but isn't blindly projecting them on the other.
Yeah, it's sort of a permanent situating. This is how I'm seeing it, and I'm aware I'm seeing it this way, which comes with its own conditions. But this is like the least worst perspective I can adopt in comparison.
Well, what the worst least? Yeah, I hope it's more than that. My own position is that we actually learn new things when we compare religions that we otherwise couldn't possibly know. That we can see patterns or similarities that suggest deeper dynamics than any close look at a single tradition could possibly tell us. Let me give you a simple example, because we've been talking in the abstract here. Those people who know something about Marian apparitions or apparitions of the Blessed Virgin in modern Catholicism know that in 1917, on October 13th, there's something happened called the Miracle of the Sun, in which upwards to 50 to 60,000 people had gathered in a valley in Portugal to witness a miracle that was supposed to happen on that day. And in fact, many of them saw the sun turn into a silver disk, spin, and then fall to the earth in a kind of zigzag motion. They thought it was the end of the world. They thought, they were all screaming and praying. And then the sun or the disk went back up into the sky and became the good old sun again. Okay, so that's the story. We have a lot of literature on that. We have a lot of witnesses. But none of the Catholic devotional materials are aware that zigzag motion is precisely the motion that is reported over and over again in UFO encounters later in the 20th century. It's even given a name in the UFO literature. It's called the zigzag, or the falling leaf motion. So suddenly, the apparition of the Virgin Mary in Portugal in 1917 lines up or looks similar to this other set of encounters that were framed in science fiction or extraterrestrial terms later in the century. Now, what the bad comparativists will do is say, oh, well, the Virgin Mary was really a space alien, or the extraterrestrials were really the Virgin Mary. In other words, he or she will privilege one worldview and shove everything into it. What the good comparativists will do is say, wow, isn't that interesting? Isn't that weird that you have the same precise phenomena in both a Catholic devotional context and a Cold War sci-fi context? It looks to me like something similar is going on in those two contexts, but I don't have the slightest idea what it is. But it obviously takes on different mythological frameworks depending on the culture and time period in which it happens. So that to me is a good comparison. The challenge of it, or the problem with it, is that it lands you nowhere.
Yeah.
people want to land somewhere. They they want to be a good Catholic, or they want to be a good extraterrestrial buff. They want to know the answer to everything. But what good comparison always does is it lands you in ambiguity and ambivalence and in a kind of both and land that is very difficult for people to inhabit. But I think that's exactly where it leads.
And you don't think that's least worst? I still think that's least worst because, yeah.
I've just never heard that expression, Gordon.
Fair enough. No, that is almost the story of my life.
Well, people don't want to be in the least worst, right? I mean, they want to be somewhere. They want to be on firm ground, and comparison doesn't give you any firm ground.
It doesn't. It can give you. It can terraform the ground a bit, which I think is a neat move into the sort of next topic area. Dr. Kripal, what even is Esalen?
Okay, so Esslin is a really good example of what I've been talking about. Esslin is an institute in Big Sur, California, that wasn't named Esslin, but was founded in the fall of 1962 by two Stanford graduates, Michael Murphy and Richard Price. And each man had a different vision in mind. Mike Murphy was envisioning a kind of intellectual ashram that would bring East and West and spirit and mysticism, or science and mysticism together. And Dig Price was really thinking about a place of healing, a place of community where people could come and find wholeness and healing through various kinds of somatic and psychological techniques. It's morphed considerably over the decades. It's still very healthy. 50, almost 55 years later. Today, it hosts about 500 seminars a year for about 15,000 people. It's a perfect example of comparison because certainly for Mike, and to a lesser extent for Dick, they both studied with a man named Frederick Spiegelberg at Stanford, who was a professor of comparative religion, and who taught them to think about worldviews and religions in these comparative ways we were speaking about earlier. The book I wrote about Esslin, the subtitle is America and the Religion of No Religion. That was a phrase right from Professor Spiegelberg's lectures and one of his first books. And it referred to a mystical experience he had in a wheat field in 1917. He was in graduate school, I believe, at that point, and he was walking through a wheat field, and he had one of these mystical encounters with the cosmos. The cosmos became alive, became conscious, and spoke to him in very dramatic, very very intimate terms. And he was sort of reeling from this sort of union with all of nature, when he then turned a corner and came upon a church, a little church, and he found himself horrified by this building, which represented this tradition that claimed to speak for this cosmic being that he had just known in the wheat field. And so he developed this really paradoxical notion of the religion of no religion, which is essentially this comparative mysticism that says that all religions are expressions of some divine source that really cannot be captured. And that to the extent any of these religions thinks that it has the final truth, they're of course mistaken. But they each have some piece of the truth. There's some expression of the source, but they themselves are not the source. And he called this insight the religion of no religion. It was a kind of high intellectual expression of really the perennialism that would come later in the counterculture, and that would get even more become even more banal and vague in the contemporary term, being spiritual but not religious. So that's essentially Esslin in a nutshell. It's not all of Esslin, of course, but that's the quick history.
Well, Esalen, whether it was founded to or not, it kind of became, I don't know, the Rivendell of a lot of these ideas that sort of shaped that mid 20th century kind of perennialism that you were referring, mid to late, so counterculture 20th century. It had all the hits speaking there. It had McKenna, it had cosmonauts, and it kind of it's almost like it accidentally ritualized it's almost an accidental portal for these ideas that for whatever reason, and this is going to be my next question, why did this religion of no religion, spiritual but not religious idea grow so well in American soil?
Yeah, so I think this takes us back to your opening comments. So I think there have always been two movies running in American history. Maybe not always, but at least for a couple hundred years now. Um, when I wrote the Esslin book, it came out in 2007. So this was the middle of the George W. Bush years. And like a lot of liberal intellectuals, I was very upset by what was happening all around me. And I was particularly upset with this notion that America and some evangelical form of Christianity are the same thing. Uh, I mean, this kind of religious nationalism was prominent even then. It's even more prominent today, of course, but it was prominent then. And I wanted to write a book that demonstrated that, okay, that's one narrative thread in American history for sure, going back to the Puritans and all of that. But there's also been this other narrative that's at work that you can see already in the mid 19th century with the transcendentalists, people like, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman. And this American story is very much about the religion of no religion. It's very much about not uh, idolizing or deifying any particular religion, but seeing some cosmic source behind all of them. I mean, if you read Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass or you read Ralph Waldo Emerson's Divinity School address, this is more than apparent. And this is in the middle of the 19th century. So when Esalen came along in the early 60s, I think what happened was it was tapping into these deep streams of American religious thought that were not evangelical and not Christian. And then what happened was the counterculture exploded all around it at about 64, 65. And you had this amazing symbiotic relationship that developed between the Institute and the broader counterculture. And the Institute became a kind of stage where all of these teachers could come and essentially sing their song or preach their wares, preach their sermons, and it became a nodal point really in the counterculture, and then beyond, and still doing that today actually. So I think the power of Esalen is that it itself certainly has its own worldview, but it doesn't impose that worldview on its teachers or its seminarians, which is what they call their students. The saying there all along has been, "We hold our dogmas lightly." So again, that kind of religion of no religion is extremely generative. Once you hold that position, you can let all sorts of things into your world. If you lock down into one worldview, you have to lock all the world out except for that one little worldview. So the comparative mysticism is extremely generative, extremely productive.
And I wonder if that's not part of the secret sauce of the religion of no religion, and it being very American, is that kind of attitude of opportunity has been there for quite some time. Like you were talking about Emerson, I want to look at functional explanations, just so we're clear, are shall we say, necessary but not sufficient. But I just wonder if there's something about misreading a landscape that looks like untrammeled, pristine nature when in fact it is, you know, the managed garden of First Nations people, and the kind of recent ish for Emerson independence story. I'm just trying to find what the kindling, as a speculation, what the kindling would have been for this specifically American religion of no religion.
What the kindling would have been?
Yeah.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that these people had mystical experiences. I mean, Emerson, wrote famously about this eyeball that he became that was all knowing and seeing all. And, it's hard to read Whitman's poetry without positing some kind of altered state or some kind of uh, mystical experience as well. So I think that's the first kindling. I think the other kindling is that these were highly, highly educated individuals who just found Christian exclusivism implausible at best. You don't actually need a mystical experience to get to the religion of no religion. You can think your way there as well, by just treating other people and other worldviews honestly and fairly. Um, so I think education and I think mystical experience, particularly when they come together, often will lead to something like this. Not always, but often, certainly, and that's been part of the American story for a long time. Um,
Gotcha. All right. I like so in that sense, the that expansive worldview is an extra dimensional kind of handover. Like that's where it came from potentially. It's because I was trying to work out why it looked different to uh, mystical experiences constructed in different cultures. What I find interesting about America, I had Mitch Horowitz on last year talking about, I think I mentioned to you, like, when we're talking about the burned over district, there's something very odd about a country that was populated by essentially religious intolerance that it ended up with such a tolerant aspect. I mean, people did have to get along, but for the pilgrims didn't flee religious intolerance; they fled so they could be intolerant, and it's kind of this remarkable.
absolutely,
It's kind of this
absolutely.
remarkable about face, really, that you end up with this 20th century, almost like lukewarm tantric hermeticism, and it allows, as you say, that kind of freedom to move in and out. But it just seems, of all the places in the world, kind of odd.
Well, yeah, and again, I am by no. Please don't hear me romanticizing American culture. I mean, its dark, ugly form has been showing for a couple years now, and has always been there. Um, but I think to kind of take it back, I mean, sort of the legal or constitutional version of the religion of no religion, of course, is the separation of church and state. And I think this gets at your previous comment about the odd paradox. What happened in early American history is that a lot of the founders and early uh, colonists knew that from their European experience that if you link the church and the state, the anybody who's in a minority religion is going to end up getting persecuted or chased out or just killed. And so they wanted to separate those two. And so, Jefferson's famous wall between church and state was instituted. And that to this day is commonly misunderstood as a kind of attack on, say, Christianity. That's how it's often described by conservative Christians, that the separation of church and state is an attack on Christianity. And what they really mean, or at least should mean, in my mind, is that the separation of church and state is a denial of religious primacy. It's not an attack on Christianity or any other religion. And in fact, when you separate church and state, what you end up doing is allowing a proliferation of different religious traditions and religious communities, because now it's literally illegal to privilege one over the other. There's a quote somewhere in my Esslin book that if you have one or two religions in a culture, you have war, you have civil war, and if you have 100 religions, you have peace. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I think that's the paradox of American culture. Its secularism ends up generating tremendous religious creativity, but Americans themselves are always tempted to then suppress all of this religious creativity by arguing for the primacy of their own religion. It just seems to be human nature, or at least Western human nature. I don't know.
You mentioned culture there, and I guess you're right. That kind of the sort of religious polyvalence you get in American culture is fairly unrivaled, which is interesting when you think. So for me, I kind of view, last time you were on, we spoke about the supernatural, and I kind of view that book almost, not really, but almost like a thematic continuation of Mutants and Mystics.
Yeah.
Because we're essentially dealing with how to describe this. We're essentially dealing with the paranormal's impact on culture. And that's what Mutants and Mystics is about. So, if you want to maybe describe that, because I find it interesting. We now need to kind of, now that I think we sort of situated in a classic historical sense some of the combinant factors that happen to get to a religion of no religion, or that kind of 60s American kind of worldview. There are other players on the board, it seems.
Right. Before we get there, let me just put one other piece on the table, though, Gordon, which I think is really crucial to not only understanding American history, but contemporary American politics. And that's the split in the culture between the rural and the urban. If you look at an election map, it's very clear that the rural areas, which of course is most of the areas of the culture, vote conservative and Republican, and most of the urban centers vote liberal and Democratic. And I think I actually grew up in the rural Midwest, and I've spent much of my adult life in urban areas, and I go back home all the time. So I'm all constantly going back and forth between these urban and rural contexts, and the differences are profound. And the two movies are running side by side, and I think what makes comparison so powerful in the urban context and so impotent in the rural areas is quite simply the sociology of the two cultures. When you live in an urban area, you live with, work with, have friends of other cultures and other races and other sexualities and other genders. It's completely common. It's just the way the world is, and it's apparent to you. It'd be hard to deny that. Where when you live in a rural area, as I did as a boy, there is no difference. There is no racial or ethnic or much less sexual or gender plurality. Now, of course, there is, but it's all hidden. It's all in the closet. And so people who live in these rural areas fear religious otherness or fear um, racial or ethnic otherness in a way that people in the urban areas simply do not. And I think that's what then spins out into these two movies you open the show with. Um, so it's not the fault of any individual, and I think everybody's being not everybody, but most people are being honest and speaking with integrity when they voice these two narratives. But they have completely different experiences of the world. If you're living in the country or you're living in a city, it's just completely different. Um,
And
so I
that's,
think that's
yeah,
the other
that's
dimension.
absolutely why I thought you would be the best guest to talk about this kind of stuff, because I don't know what the solve for that is other than comparative best practice. People can call each other, Nazi, and it's not going to do anything. It's just going to turn the sound up on the two movies, and that's the bit that I'm trying to I'm trying to wonder about.
Well, I think so. But I can tell you to do you so I could go to the American Midwest and teach courses or teach free classes on how to compare religions, and that would have some impact, I think. Or I could write a column for Midwestern newspapers on how to think about religion, and that would have some impact too. But until people meet or even live with or work with people who do not think like them, do not look like them, do not believe like them, I think it's a very hard sell, and we're going to be stuck with these two movies.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe there needs to be some kind of mass home swapping for a month going on, because I think experiencing the regional lifeways may uh, soften the hardened opinions of urban liberals against the actual difficulties and hardships that are found in regional areas. And I wonder if maybe we just have to kind of go, right, everyone, you have to swap houses for a month, and then we'll all meet up and compare notes.
well, that would certainly help a lot. I don't see that happening, but
No, no.
it's a good. Uh,
Cool. So,
so
yeah, carry on.
yeah, to go back to the mutants piece. So take us back to the mutants piece, Gordon. What is it you want to
Well,
talk
we're
about?
in a situation, we're in a charged cultural situation, not just in the US, but across all Western cultures at the moment for a variety of factors. And where I find this interesting is if you look at, actually, it might be easier. So, if you could encapsulate the kind of broad thesis of mutants and mystics, would it be fair to say that it's an exploration of the paranormal's impact on, say, 20th century American culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to play it out a bit, the argument is that the best place to look for the power of the paranormal is in creative fiction and in art, the art of popular culture. And the argument I made in the book is that these artists and these writers who write and paint and draw these things have had these experiences. And instead of trying to prove them in some kind of laboratory or scientific sense, they turn them into art or film or a graphic novel. And that film or graphic novel then flows into the public culture and has a kind of feedback influence on people's subsequent paranormal experiences. And so there's a kind of loop effect that's taking place between popular culture and the paranormal in American society, and it's been going on for a long time now.
And this would be the reading the paranormal and writing the paranormal. So it's kind of that's both sides as it spins around.
Right. That yeah, absolutely. That the best, we talked about this last time, but the best expression of this actually comes from Whitley Strieber, who once said to a group of us that he knows perfectly well that the visionary components of his encounter experiences were all informed by the bad science fiction movies he saw in the 50s as a little boy. But he would also insist that he really encountered something. And so his response to that fact is the call to make better science fiction movies, so that future people have better encounter experiences. So that you could, the paradox of that and the loopiness of that is apparent, but I think it's also profound that we're essentially creating the worldview right now in which our grandchildren will be born into and will experience.
Well, that's kind of. I mean, the thesis, it's sort of, I've described it a lot on my blog in a couple of the books as well, but, and it's certainly something Jacques Vallée was, or is big on, which is this idea that the extra dimensional's kind of main vector of manipulation, for good or ill, we don't know, possibly both, possibly all of the above, is in human culture. And so I guess what I want to sort of think about is, what are the implications of that thesis, which I think is extremely sound, during a culture war? Not only is it a war in the extra dimensional sense, or can we just kind of go, well, I hope not, but regardless, the best thing for us to do, given that it falls to us to make those worldviews, is to make better art?
Well, I think it's certainly a magical battle. I don't think it's an all-out war yet, and I hope it never becomes that. But sometimes magical battles do become, of course, literal wars. Um, I suppose the answer for me is, um, one responds to these situations best out of one's own skills and one's own sense of calling. And at least for some of us, particularly myself, let me just speak for myself. The best response is to keep teaching and writing and speaking and doing all of that in public. To try to move out of the silos of the profession and expertise and reach broader and broader audiences with what it is we've been saying all along in the academy. I mean, really, what the humanities have been arguing for hundreds of years now is that human beings are manipulated. So Jacques' theory about some kind of interdimensional manipulation, for me, is really a kind of sci-fi, but very accurate expression of the profound ways that individuals do not have freedom and are manipulated by the narratives they're born into and the languages they speak and the way their sensory system is taught to perceive the world. If there's any single argument of the humanities, it's that we're not who we think we are, and we're not in control the way we think we are. We are being manipulated by the stories and the cultures that our ancestors created, sometimes hundreds of even thousands of years ago. And so I'm very drawn to that thesis because I think I think it's correct, and B, I think it suggests ways to get us out of this fix, which is we've got to change the story. We've got to change the narrative. You can't just, if somebody's having a heart attack, you don't walk up and put a Band-Aid on their shoulder. You got to get to the heart somehow. And if your computer's crashing, you don't polish the screen. You got to get into the guts of the thing and figure out whether it's a hardware or software problem. And I think what we're seeing now in our cultures, it's a serious, serious computer crash. And we've got to get into the operating system and really start to rewrite the whole thing.
So Jungian depth psychology for the whole culture.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not speaking in Jungian terms here. I'm really speaking about the deep mythical narratives that drive Western culture and the profoundly unconscious ways that human beings have have been shaped and formed. Now, you could talk about that in Jungian terms or Freudian terms or Marxist terms or Foucauldian terms or any other terms you want, but I think the insight remains valid. And I think the kind of magical battle you were referring to earlier is a very precise way, actually, of talking about the same insight. My own feeling, so when academics in the humanities talk about discourse, in this sort of Foucauldian sense, they're talking about the ways language and story shape a culture and so an individual. When I think of discourse in the Mutants and Mystics book, I'm really thinking of magic. I mean, I think words and stories literally shape reality. And the way we speak and the way we think, which is of course just another way of speaking in our heads, is actually determining the shape of reality. And so I think of these things in magical or occult terms, as well as in more traditional academic terms. But I think they're all pointing in the same direction.
Yeah, well, certainly no argument here on that, but it brings up a good point then, because Mutants and Mystics kind of covers the 20th century heyday of comics, but here in 2017, no one reads comics. Comic movies, like the rest of culture, are shit. So, for this magical battle, what is the common surface between culture creators and, if you want to call it, the extra dimensional or the other side of the one-way mirror, or wherever that well is where we get new stories and inspiration from? Well, here's the thing. I mean, all the wells have been kind of poisoned, so it's a challenging first couple of moves in the battle.
Well, I'm not sure it's ever been any different, Gordon. I mean, I'm not romanticizing any particular cultural form. When I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, comic books were a kind of trash literature. They held no space in the public culture in any way. I do think film has great potential here. I think science fiction in particular has had a very positive impact on reshaping these worlds. I also think science has a role to play here. Hard professional science, which is, of course, completely reshaping our narratives as well. I don't have any silver bullets here or easy ways out. I'm caught in the cave of shadows like everyone else, and I'm struggling to get out and to try to figure out ways to talk to people who don't even know they're in a cave.
Yeah.
Um,
So let me,
so
all right, let me give
yeah,
you this one then. For the recent release of Jerusalem, Alan Moore was interviewed in The Guardian. And he kind of echoed what you were saying, except I just want to push back on a part of that. He echoed what you were saying about comics, which was they were largely irrelevant to the monoculture in which they were found. But that's the good bit. Our mutual friend Chris Knowles would say that's the good bit, because that was the place where the freaks would go. That was the place. That was a space, a thing for the weird and the odd, and those kind of culture creators. And Alan Moore said, when he got into comics, they were hugely disreputable, and now they're not. And so he got into magic, and even magic has become a little bit reputable now, much to my own shock. And so the joke was, now he has moved into literary fiction, because that is the disreputable, discarded thing in 2017, with this enormous, meandering book set in a couple of blocks in his hometown. He said that's the what comics was in the early 80s, literary fiction is now. And I wonder if there is a sense, I mean, I'm just going to give that to you, and I wonder if there's a sense of, do we need to kind of, is it ballet and literary fiction? Is that where we all gather now?
So I have an almost exact version of what Moore said. I often say reading is the new counterculture. What I mean by that is I don't think anybody reads anymore. I think they sit around with their thumbs texting each other on their smartphones, or they're surfing the internet and sort of, breeze reading things. But I mean, I teach, for a living. I work with young people, and a lot of my job is trying to get young people to read books, and it's really, really hard. They don't want to read a book anymore. It's too long, it's too thick, it's too complicated. uh, and so I think he's right about that. I don't think that gives us an answer. I mean, I think if our goal is to reach broader and broader publics and to cross this divide between these two movies, we can't just be writing 800-page novels, or academic books. In my case, that's just not going to do it. We've got to come up with some other way.
But is there not something quintessentially Gnostic about that? Because I kind of think there is. I kind of think the signal has to be difficult to hear, and I think that's always been the case. Because if you try to scale it up, you end up with Age of Ultron, which was a dumpster fire of kind of military propaganda, trying to kind of normalize people for a U.S. invasion of Ukraine. And you go, if you try to scale it up to the monocultural level, there is something Gnostic in it that it doesn't work, and it's almost like you have to be willing to listen a little hard. You have to go and find the comics. You have to go and do that. And I'm not saying we should all go and be literary novelists either, but I do wonder if there isn't something to the idea that there's something mysterious to me about the fact that books, which used to be difficult to get and dangerous, are now like they're neither, but they're not read. It's almost like that kind of gap has returned. There's something kind of coming back to that almost one-way mirror, other side, or common surface to culture with something else behind it. There are pieces being moved around here, it seems to me.
Well, I'm deeply sympathetic to what you just expressed. I mean, I think esotericism is esoteric for a reason, and historically, things are esoteric because it's dangerous to speak those things openly or out loud. Um, I I just worry, again, we're in a new political climate, and I worry that if Gnostics and academics and freaks all stay in their technical subcultures, that a lot of damage is going to be done in the broader culture and on the planet. So I'm not voicing any kind of messiah complex here. I'm just worried that a lot of smart people are not going to speak out for whatever good reasons they have, and that it really is time to kind of pivot or to change tactics here in terms of being a public intellectual or a public creative. But I hear you. I listen. When I go back to the rural Midwest, I feel nothing but an immense cultural abyss, and I feel a lot of despair, and I inevitably come back to Houston and my university depressed about the possibility of bridging that abyss. So I totally understand that impulse, and I share it largely, but I also hope we keep trying.
Oh yeah, it's astounding, isn't it? All those, if you're talking about in economically depressed or regional areas, they still have 4G mobile signal, which means the devices they're tapping away on have access to basically every single book ever written in any language on Earth. And again, it's there's some kind of like Gnostic demiurgic laugh behind all this. It's never been
Right.
easier and never been further away.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I also think, I've spent a lot of my career telling my colleagues that if the public knew what we thought, they would, tar and feather us in the public square. And I still think that. Um, and I don't know what the proper response to that is, other than to keep speaking and to speak again with as much clarity as we can, but also realizing, as you keep saying, that it perhaps it's just true that most people aren't there and can't hear it. You know, I mean, this goes back to the Gospels. Let he who has ears hear, which of course means most people won't.
Yeah, because I certainly share your concern that if people are timid for the kind of dramatic cultural engineering it looks like not just the US, but certainly Europe, if the elections go the way they go this year and so on, is to expect. Uh, I share your concerns about that, but then I wonder if it isn't a. I've been calling for the last couple of years, particularly when it comes to occultism or Western occultism, we're heading into a Rivendell phase where you have to be like the last lovely house east of the sea. Like, you have to be the person who knows Plato. You have to be the person who knows this stuff because eventually we're going to want it again. And I know that's almost defeatist, but in a kind of way it isn't. If you look at the sort of history of magic, this happens every couple of centuries, so you can kind of get a bit fatalistic about it and remain optimistic. But it's as we open the show with, like, it's strange days for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Mircea Eliade, who founded the history of religions at the University of Chicago, in which I was trained in the late '80s, used to talk about the comparative study of religion as the kind of Noah's Ark. And he was thinking of some kind of nuclear winter or nuclear holocaust, and that
That's still on
the
the table. Come on.
no, it absolutely is on the table. But I'm just referring to the Noah's Ark approach, that is another way of expressing the same
Yeah,
insight.
it is, and as a result, I wonder if, as culture hasn't, because again, we aren't the only people. Culture is our common surface with whatever's behind what you called in the in Supernatural behind the one-way mirror. Culture is our main common surface with that, and I wonder if the surface or the topology hasn't changed so that we're starting to see what looks like lifeboats, like literary fiction. Because I tell you what, Trump supporters aren't going to go and burn there first. For instance, it's surprising that you can kind of have a shape that. That may be just what we need.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a real wake-up call for certainly a lot of my friends and colleagues. And I mean, I haven't seen this much activism ever, certainly in my life. I mean, I was just a little boy in the '60s, so I don't remember that, but I haven't seen anything remotely like this in the 50 odd years of my life.
Yeah, and glass half full. I actually think that's very good. I think it's very good that you know again it's glass half full. But the women's march in particular very like it impressed the pants off the rest of the world. Let me tell you, that was uh,
Well, so I was in that march here in Houston, and it was the only day I've felt real hope in the last 2 or 3 months, and it was deeply moving, particularly the way the crowd interacted with the police. The police were giggling a lot because a lot of the posters were very, very funny, but they were also waving, and there was just a lot of affection and a lot of moral support being expressed. It was really moving, actually.
I write a
And
sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I write a weekly newsletter on politics and parapolitics, and I think it was in that one I said that it only took Trump a couple of weeks to fulfill his biggest campaign promise, which is to make America great again, because that's what I saw that weekend.
right, that's a nice way to spin it. Oh gosh, yeah.
Well, Dr. K, this has been really fascinating and really good. It's helpful to kind of, I think, for the listeners realize that there are modes of thought for kind of analyzing where you're at, where other people are at, and that there's good news in amongst the anxiety and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's difficult. Again, I don't want to underestimate all of that, but I think difficult times generate new creativity and new responses, and so we need to do that. We need to, get in, dig down, get in the trenches, and get to work. And
Wise words to end on.
I don't know if they're wise, but they're certainly words.
All right. Well, once again, thank you very much for your time.
All right, Gordon. Take care.
Earlier this week, James Howard Kunstler wrote about how it's the center that has hollowed out and collapsed, and it was in the center, for all its flaws, that we interacted with those we disagree with. In a similar vein, economist Tyler Cohen, one of my favorites, as you know, has recently published a book called The Complacent Class that explores this self-isolationism in great detail. What is the shared story? And I guess this was my question for this week, that we organize around now that the farthest ends of the left and right spectrum have abandoned the admittedly poorly examined narrative of the continuous and eventual improvement of society as a whole, that sort of general promise. And that's why I thought speaking to a comparativist might deliver up some food for thought. Because not just in America, but across the West, the primary trend for the next few years has visibly asserted itself, whether you like it or not. So my questions were, and remain, how do we navigate this state of affairs? That's number one. And number two, where are the reinforcements going to come from? Because in the widest possible spiritual sense, this is all just weather in a way. I mean, one day you will still die. So you could say that the terrain changes, but the destination's still the same. The destination being, in this case, of course, a re-enchanted world. And it seems to me there's probably insight to be gained from kind of deep diving into comparativism that can improve the polyvalence of our maps. Speaking of polyvalence, feel free to subscribe to the show on YouTube or in your favorite podcatcher to hear other voices. Get your own valency on at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. And because I couldn't think of another valent thing, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.